So hopefully I'll be able to get this video for a February event out before the end of February. Hello, I'm Tim and I have too many books. It's a bit late in the day to be doing this. I'm recording this on the last day of February, but February was the month of Home is Where the Heart Is, which is a booktube event where you talk all things Sherlock Holmes and look into things like pastiches. I have a collection here of 12 pastiches which I think might be of interest, and I've read 8 of them and 4 of them are very definitely on my TBR. So let's go, shall we? I should first say that the Home is Where the Heart Is booktube event is hosted by Book Time with Elvis, Big Hard Books and Classics, Mystery and Mayhem, Randy Ray the Literate Texan, and another bibliophile reads. The first book I want to talk about is 1906's Our Holmes & Co. by John Kendrick Bangs. John Kendrick Bangs was an American satirist and humorist who wrote a fair number of books, and one of them dealt with a certain Raffles Holmes. One of the things that's always intrigued me about Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes is that Conan Doyle's brother-in-law was E.W. Hornung, and E.W. Hornung wrote the Raffles books, The Amateur Cracksman. A.J. Raffles is a first-class cricketer who also dabbles in stealing jewels. What I've always wondered about is whether there was any conversation between Hornung and Doyle about their mutual creations, and whether there was ever any proposal to have them team up or go against each other in some way. But there seems to have been nothing official, and certainly no major pastiches that I can think of in recent times which have dealt with this. However, in 1906, John Kendrick Bangs made just what I was looking for, or approximating to it. His character of Raffles Holmes is the grandson of A.J. Raffles and the son of Sherlock Holmes. Basically, Sherlock Holmes falls in love with Raffles' daughter while investigating a jewel robbery perpetrated by A.J. Raffles. Now, technically, this doesn't match the official ages of A.J. Raffles and Sherlock Holmes. They were actually of an age. We know approximately how old A.J. Raffles was because he died a somewhat heroic death serving Queen and country in the Boer War, in some way making up for all the crimes he had committed. And Sherlock Holmes is sort of in his 40s by that time, so they would have been approximately the same age. Raffles would not be a full generation older than Sherlock Holmes. So the idea of Sherlock Holmes having a child by A.J. Raffles' daughter is a little bit strange. However, this is unofficial, so we can just go with it. We first meet Raffles Holmes when he breaks into the house of a journalist and asks that journalist to be his Bunny Manders or Dr. Watson, his amanuensis, the person who chronicles his adventures. And the writer is fairly happy to do so. We're told that Raffles Holmes has the thievery instincts of his grandfather and the moral righteousness and investigative abilities of his father. We've got a series of stories where Raffles Holmes has a series of dodgy dealings, but is always on the side of justice. He will, for example, steal a rich lady's jewels in order to protect them and make sure that he gets a reward for giving them back, while making sure that he's not blamed for the initial robbery. The stories are entertaining and slight. They're not particularly brain-teasing as to the mysteries, but they are quite a lot of fun. They're more in the line of a Raffles book than in a line of a Sherlock Holmes book. But it's an interesting add-on, and I would love to see somebody with a greater footing in the Sherlock Holmes side of things to do a story of where they tackle Raffles in some way. The next book is The Exploits of Sherlock Holmes by Adrian Conan Doyle and John Dickson Carr. Adrian Conan Doyle was the son of Arthur Conan Doyle, and in the 1940s he sat down at his father's desk and wrote a number of stories, sometimes with the help of John Dickson Carr. John Dickson Carr is a detective novelist who wrote a lot of really good crime stories in the 30s and 40s, was a member of the Detection Club in Britain, and his books are very well worth reading. The basic conceit of the stories contained in The Exploits of Sherlock Holmes is that they are the stories that Dr. Watson sometimes mentions. Unfortunately, there is no giant rat of Sumatra, but there are in total 12 stories, and at the end of each story there is a footnote quoting Dr. Watson mentioning the particular story that's just been told. These stories fall short of classic Sherlock Holmes, and it has to be noted that this book hasn't been in print since the 1980s. So perhaps it's not quite as official as it used to be. Reading these stories, I found that while they fitted quite well with the literal words used by Dr. Watson to describe them, and they had pleasingly logical explanations for the phrases that Dr. Watson uses. Once you found out what happened, you didn't feel surprised. You were a little bit disappointed. It wasn't that the stories had unexpected elements to them, but it was more that they just didn't have that that Arthur Conan Doyle twist or sort of magic sprinkles added to them. The next book is In Re Sherlock Holmes, The Adventures of Solar Pons by August Derleth. In the late 1920s, when August Derleth, as a teenager, discovered that Arthur Conan Doyle was no longer writing any Sherlock Holmes stories, he wrote to Arthur Conan Doyle and said, "Can I write some?" He apparently got a very gracious denial from Arthur Conan Doyle, but he decided that he would attempt his own Sherlock Holmes-like stories. He created a character called Solar Pons, the name chosen simply because it sounds a little bit like Sherlock Holmes. Solar Pons lives and works in the 1920s and 30s, when the early stories were written, and he lives in a world where Sherlock Holmes existed before him. Solar Pons lives at 7A Praed Street, not too far from Baker Street. He has an assistant who documents his efforts called Dr. Linton Parker, and he even has a landlady called Mrs. Johnson. Derleth wrote over 70 Solar Pons stories, and they are often counted as the best pastiches of Sherlock Holmes out there. In fact, he is so well beloved in the world of Sherlock Holmes pastiches that well-known authors have written their own Solar Pons stories, and you'll often find new and interesting Solar Pons stories in publications that also do new and interesting Sherlock Holmes stories. August Derleth wrote over 70 stories. I read just his first book, just the first collection of these. They do suffer from a lot of Americanisms, which isn't a problem until you have somebody, say, jumping out of a second floor window, which in Britain would cause serious injury and in America might, at worst, give you a broken ankle. When he wrote the early Solar Pons stories, August Derleth hadn't actually visited Britain, so he was getting all his information from third hand and from the sort of the caricatures that people have of America. All the same, Solar Pons stories are very entertaining and do fit the sort of the Sherlockian model very well. The next book is The Last Sherlock Holmes Story by Michael Dibdin from 1978. There is always a temptation when we are dealing with Sherlock Holmes, who was active in the 1880s and 1890s, to pair him up with a murderer who was active in the late 1880s, and that is Jack the Ripper. Michael Dibdin creates an interesting entry into the tales of Sherlock Holmes versus Jack the Ripper. In this, Sherlock Holmes believes the Ripper to be Moriarty, and when the real Moriarty is finally unearthed, it is at the site of the final canonical murder by Jack the Ripper. This book also puts a rather interesting twist on what exactly happens at the Reichenbach Falls. This is Michael Dibdin's first novel, and in later life he wrote a series of around 11 books featuring Aurelio Zen, a rather cynical Venetian detective who mostly works out of Rome. The next book is Dust and Shadow by Lyndsay Faye from 2009. And this is a book I haven't read, and is another book that is Sherlock Holmes versus Jack the Ripper. Again, she has to come up with an identity for Jack the Ripper, and not quite in the same way that Michael Dibdin did. Lyndsay Faye seems to specialise in 19th century set novels where she works in figures from 19th century Victorian literature. She's also written a series of novels featuring a character who joins the New York police force in its very early days. The next book is The Italian Secretary by Caleb Carr from 2005. This started life as an official short story written by Caleb Carr, which he then expanded into a full novel. I haven't read this novel yet, but apparently the action takes place in and around Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh. Queen Victoria is under threat, and two people have already lost their lives when Sherlock Holmes goes to investigate. The investigation has historical links dating back to the murder of David Rizzio, who was Mary Queen of Scots' music teacher and her favourite, and was allegedly murdered by her husband, Darnley. The next book is a bit of a change of scene. The Alchemist's Daughter by Theodora Goss from 2017. In this book we are dealing with a number of women connected to fictional characters in Victorian literature. One of our protagonists is Mary Jekyll, the daughter of Dr. Jekyll, and she sets out to find her sister Diana, who is the daughter of Dr. Jekyll's alter ego, Mr. Hyde. We also have a series of women who are created by some kind of experiment, such as a woman created by Frankenstein, Rappaccini's daughter, and somebody who was created by Dr. Moreau. Sherlock Holmes features as a major side character in this story. Mary Jekyll teams up with him for her investigation, and she helps out on his investigations and becomes eventually his secretary and gets a lot more involvement in some of his cases. This book is the first book in a trilogy, all of which are very entertaining. And although she is an American, Theodora Goss does paint a accurate seeming picture of Victorian London. And she even caught me out in one or two facts. The next book is A Slight Trick of the Mind by Mitch Cullin from 2005. This might be better known to people as the film Mr. Holmes, which was made in 2015. When the film came out, the Conan Doyle estate launched a lawsuit against the film company and against Mitch Cullin, claiming that there was still copyright on the older version of Sherlock Holmes. This issue was settled out of court, and subsequent editions of the books contain a "with thanks" to the Conan Doyle estate. I haven't read this book yet, but it's set in 1947, where a 93-year-old Sherlock Holmes, in retirement in Sussex, keeping his bees, has his life interrupted by a young boy and his mother, who lead him down a path of reminiscence and to one of his more difficult cases. The next book is House of Silk by Anthony Horowitz from 2011. This claims to be the first officially sanctioned Sherlock Holmes novel since Arthur Conan Doyle. The earlier Carr novel was of course based on an officially sanctioned short story. This book starts with Sherlock Holmes investigating an art dealer who has been pursued by a flat-capped man all the way from America. But Sherlock Holmes gets sidetracked into the stories of the House of Silk, which is some kind of very high-level conspiracy. I don't really want to give away about exactly what the House of Silk is, but if you've heard of the Cleveland Street scandal from 1889, you may have a very good idea. That is a scandal that threatened to engulf Eddie, the Duke of Clarence, first son of Edward, Prince of Wales, and the heir presumptive to the British throne. I really enjoyed this book, and I always seem to enjoy Anthony Horowitz's work. And this was suitably Sherlockian. He took a great deal of care to make us feel as if it really was Dr. Watson telling us the story. The only slight problem is that it's dealing with subject matter that Conan Doyle would not have touched at all. He wouldn't have gone anywhere near this, and that does ring a slightly false note in this. All the same, it is a very good entry into Sherlock Holmes Pastiche, and I would heartily recommend it. The edition that I read had a commentary on the rules that Andy Horowitz used in the writing of this novel. I think there are about 10 of them. The next book, which I haven't read yet, is Sherlock Holmes, A Scandal in Japan by Keisuke Matsuoka. This is yet another entry into the books written in Sherlock Holmes's hiatus, that period between Holmes's disappearance at the Reichenbach Falls and his reappearance in the empty room. This book has a fugitive and disguised Sherlock Holmes getting involved in the investigation surrounding the Otsu incident. This was an attempted assassination on the Tsarevich of Russia, Nicholas, who later became Nicholas II, the last Tsar. He was on a visit travelling back from Kyoto when a Japanese policeman slashed at him with his sabre and caused him non-life-threatening injuries. In this story we are told that Sherlock Holmes gets involved with Japan's first Prime Minister, Hosumi Ito, as they delve into the deeper causes of this assassination attempt and the potential connections with the great powers and their machinations. Our next book is The 7% Solution by Nicholas Meyer from 1974. This is another Sherlock Holmes hiatus novel. It is 1891, and his cocaine addiction has driven Sherlock Holmes to breaking point. Holmes has become increasingly obsessed by Moriarty, who may or may not exist. So Mycroft Holmes and Dr. Watson pack him off to Vienna to visit a certain Sigmund Freud. With the help of Sigmund Freud, Holmes and Watson discover the real identity of Moriarty. And at the same time, all three of them get involved with a plot that might quickly drive Europe into a major war, something that wouldn't in reality happen for about 24 years. Nicholas Mayer's a rather fascinating fellow. He has to date written, I think, 6 of these Sherlock Holmes pastiches. He wrote the first in 1974, he wrote one in the 1980s and one in the 1990s. Then there was a pause for, a good 20 years before he came back and wrote another 3. The most recent one, I think, is just about to be published. If you are a Star Trek fan, you may know that he directed and directed 3 of the Star Trek movies. The first 3 even-numbered ones. You know, the good ones. Wrath of Khan, The Voyage Home, and An Undiscovered Country. He's also written and directed quite a lot of pretty good television and films over the years. He's certainly a writer to watch. It's sometimes since I read the 7% Solution. I did enjoy it at the time, and I think I might reread it before I go on to the next book in the sequence, which is The West End Horror, which is Nicholas Mayer's take on Sherlock Holmes versus a Ripper-like figure rather than Jack the Ripper himself. Our last book is The Beekeeper's Apprentice by Laurie R. King from 1994. This seems to be a very well-regarded pastiche series. It has run so far, I think, to 18 if not 19 books, as well as novellas and short stories. The main character of these stories is Mary Russell. When we first meet her, she is a 15-year-old girl. She is half American, half British, and part Jewish. She is living in Sussex with an aunt who really doesn't like her. In her wanderings through Sussex, she comes across Sherlock Holmes in retirement, keeping his bees. She befriends Sherlock Holmes and becomes his assistant, and I think in later books, actually his wife. A lot of people have complained about this because of the 4-decade age gap between Holmes in this book and Mary Russell. I felt that this book was generally well written, and the cases contained in the book have a nice Sherlockian flavour to them, and a very authentic one. Her portrayal of Sherlock Holmes feels real and feels like the one of the book. However, another one of the wide criticisms of the Mary Russell series is her portrayal of Dr. Watson. Now, my surname is Watson, and I've had to put up with a lot of lemon entry, my dear Watson, and other jokes in my time, so I'm a little bit sensitive to portrayals of Dr. Watson, and I am very eager always to see him portrayed correctly. And I would personally make the argument that the best Dr. Watson portrayal was Jude Law. Unfortunately, Laurie R. King's portrayal of Dr. Watson owes more to Nigel Bruce. In fact, she makes Nigel Bruce look positively svelte, cunning and intelligent. In this, Dr. Watson is a bumbling idiot, and you wonder how he ever got to be a doctor if he's so clumsy and stupid. And there are very few portrayals of Dr. Watson that get close to him as he is in the short stories and the novels. He may always be 1 or 2 steps behind Sherlock Holmes, but he's 1 or 2 steps behind a genius, and that doesn't make you an idiot. The thing that really bothered me about this novel, and means that I might not continue with the series, is what I'd like to call the Freudian slip. I'm not a trained historian, but I am kind of a history sensitive. I know enough history to be bothered if people get things wrong. One of the stories in this book is set in January 1918. The wife of a senior British government advisor tells Sherlock Holmes and Mary Russell all about the occasional debilitating illness that her husband suffers from, and all the efforts that they have made to try to find a cure. We're told that they've been seeking a cure for advisors all over Britain, and have even travelled to the continent without any luck. One expert said that there may be a psychological cause for his illness. That expert was Dr. Sigmund Freud. When I read this line, I had to get up and walk around for half an hour to get myself calm again. If you don't know why it's a problem, could I suggest that you find out where Sigmund Freud was in 1917, which is presumably when they went to consult him. Now, I don't entirely blame Laurie King for making this mistake, but it completely threw me. It stopped me trusting her. I kept second guessing her throughout the rest of the book. It's a decently written book, but, you know, it kind of spoiled the rest of the book for me and made me not want to go on with this. Now, okay, writers make mistakes. I shouldn't make a big fuss about this. I realise that. But, you know, it's not just Laurie King that made the mistake here. I checked to see if I was the only one who'd noticed this, and it kind of looks as if I am. This book has been out for more than 30 years, and nobody has seemed to mention the Freudian slip. Nobody. What's going on, guys? I mean, isn't that sort of thing important to you? That's my selection of some pastiches for Holmes Where the Heart Is. I hope I'll get this out in time for the end of February. Goodbye.